Okay, it looks like we're all here. Welcome to the Wild Writers Festival, everyone. I am Pamela Mulloy. I am the editor of the New Quarterly, and I'm the creative director of the Wild Writers Festival. Welcome to our festival, which is the 9th year for our festival. This is the first time that we're doing it online. But we're happy to, although we would like to be in person, of course, we're happy to welcome people from across the country to our session today. I'm especially happy to have everybody here on this beautiful day, have chosen to stay inside and be on the computer. And I'm especially happy we can all be very happy about the world events and how things are developing outside of our rooms and have a little bit of joy around that as well as we try to figure out the path to publications together. We are running our festival across November this year for the 3 weeks of November. So please check out our website, wildwriters.ca, for workshops, conversations, mentorships, and meditations. Now I'm going to introduce our 3 other panelists. I'm going to read a brief bio, and then we'll get started with some questions. I'll start with Shalene Knight. Chelene is the author of Braided Skin and the memoir Dear Current Occupant, winner of the 2018 Vancouver Book Award. Her essays have appeared in multiple literary journals, as well as the Globe and Mail, the Walrus, and the Toronto Star. She was previously the editor of Room magazine and previous editor of Growing Room Literary Festival in Vancouver. She is now CEO of her own literary studio, Breathing Space Creative, and works as an associate literary agent with the Transatlantic Agency. Shalene often gives talks about home, belonging and belief, inclusivity, and community building through authentic storytelling. And she also teaches part-time at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Shalene.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with all of you. Thank you, Pamela.
Next up is Russell Smith, whose most recent book, Confidence, was longlisted for the Giller Prize and shortlisted for the Rogers Trust Fiction Prize. His English translation of Nadine Bismuth's award-winning novel, Un lien familial, sorry for the pronunciation, has just been published by House of Anansi. He is now working as an acquiring editor at Dundurn Press. His techno dance mixes can be found on Mixcloud under the name of DJ Roomtone. Nice to have you back at Wild Writers, Russell.
Hi, thanks, Pamela. It's nice to be here and nice to see all of you.
And last but not least is Brent Van Stalden, an award-winning writer from Hamilton. He is the author of the novels Boy, the forthcoming Nothing But Life, and Saints Unexpected, as well as the forthcoming short fiction collection Cut Road. His stories have won the Bristol Short Story Prize, the Lush Triumphant Literary Award, and the Fiddlehead Fiction Award, and have appeared in many literary journals. A recovering high school teacher, tree planter, army medic, and radio announcer, Brent now finds himself working at the Hamilton Public Library, helping other writers find his voice. Welcome to you, Brent. Nice to see you back at the festival.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So the way that we're going to do this is I have a lot of questions to ask that have been primarily come from our audience, either in advance or from some of our regular festival attendees who came. We did a focus group earlier this year, and we just asked them about the kind of things that they'd like to see for an online festival. And so some of the questions have come from that group as well. So I tried to kind of consolidate it so that we're kind of covering a lot of bases. But I did want to just say a thank you to Ruth Edgett, who was one of our focus group members, whose idea it was to bring these the writer and agent and editors together. And some of these questions are from her. So thank you, Ruth. Okay. We'll also have time at the end of the session to answer some of the questions that may come in during the session. I'll try to get to those. So if you have them, you can pop them into the, you can pop them into the Q&A. Okay, let's get started. Hilary Mantel said this year, when she didn't make the Booker Prize, that books are born in a certain cultural moment. They surf on the tide of times. If you are currently writing a book that you believe is timeless, but that may not satisfy current hot topics, is it better to wait to approach an editor or publisher? I guess this question is really about, are there trends in publishing that writers should pay attention to? Russell, do you want to start with this one?
Well, yes, I mean, obviously it is true that there are trends in publishing. However, it would be deadly for writers to pay attention to them. That it would obviously stifle all of your best creative instincts to be trying to write a book to satisfy whatever particular publishers are most looking for as a trend for the following season. The other problem for that is that it would be really technically unfeasible because the timeline's involved. I mean, think about it. If you are watching the news and you think, boy, I should really probably get in on it with a timely, I don't know, election story right now. It's going to take you probably what, a year to write it, and then another few months to find a publisher, then another year at the best for it to come out. So by the time it comes out, there's going to be a whole new topic obsessing us all. And so I would say that that would be extremely unproductive for any writer. And also, I like to think, I hope that I'm open-minded as an editor, and that I'm going to not be picking things simply on the basis of whether they're culturally of the moment. It's funny, you do though see trends of books that are submissions that do seem to follow certain patterns all at once. And it's interesting because I don't think those writers are really thinking about trying to fit that trend. It's just naturally all coming out at the same time. I have had recently a whole series of submissions of dystopian novels about a world in a pandemic or after a pandemic. You know what's really funny though, is that many of those, most of them in fact, the writers insist that they had started writing them long before the pandemic happened. It's just one of those things that writers were afraid of before it happened. We are going to probably see a little bump in books about a pandemic that are happening, but to set out to try to capture that, you're always going to be behind. And also you're going to be writing cynically. You're not going to be writing really what's naturally coming out.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. We had our contest, fiction and essay contest earlier this year, and we have actually had some pandemic stories that came in. So I don't know if they were written really kind of at the last minute, but it was interesting to see those coming in. And you know, maybe if maybe we want to actually move away from the pandemic's stories into a new trend.
I'm swamped at the moment. Yeah.
Chelene, do you want to come in and talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Russell said. I think that's a really great way for authors to look at it. Like you definitely want to write the stories that feel urgent to you, you know, the stories that call you. That's what brings out, I think, the most authentic writing. And I think that will show itself on the page. You know, I think there are definitely ebbs and flows. You know, I think some of these themes and trends are definitely, you know, cyclical, and they come back and they kind of revolve in this circle. But I think it's really important to focus on what your story is. And for me as an agent, when I have my agent hat on, I'm looking for stories that are structured in a really unique way. So I'm really focused on pacing, on structure, on language, on, you know, the stories that teach me something different about the world, right? And that can take so many shapes and forms in itself. And I think if we as authors are trying to write something to fit into a category or to fit into a trend, that is probably the worst thing we can do for our books. I know for me, I often, you know, I'll attach to certain themes. I'll be, ooh, I'm really interested in this, but I'm going to go a little bit further as I'm reading, and I'm going to look for, again, that structure. How does this story do something to me that another story written on the same topic doesn't do, right? So you really have to go in and sort of break down the story in that way. And I think it's really important for the author to understand the production process as well, the life cycle of a book. What happens when an editor says yes to your book, and how long before that book will be on the shelf? So there's so many things that happen in between that time that if you think that you're writing to a particular trend, you know, 2 years later, maybe when that book is out there, all of a sudden people are saying, well, what's that all about? You know, so that whole idea of following trends, I think, yeah, definitely as an author, I would say, just kind of put your blinders up and just focus on writing your stories in the best way that makes sense for you.
I'm going to just play devil's advocate here and just say, well, I think, books need to be marketed though. And isn't the marketing come from those trends so that the marketing people can say, well, this is another, dystopian book and we sold lots of dystopian books last year. So
Right.
for writers that they see that these are the ones that are getting bought and out in the world. I think that's probably part of the reason why this becomes an issue for writers.
And it can certainly trouble you, and it's a voice that's barking in your ear all the time. This isn't relevant. I'm not writing about the things that everyone's talking about right now. Maybe I should be, and that's very much one of those voices you need to block out. You should absolutely not listen to that voice. If you write a fascinating book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, on a subject that's never even occurred to me before, I'm going to read it and it's going to get published. It does not. Absolutely doesn't. And you're right, the marketing department's going to pick up on the topicality of things, and we just all out of our hands. I always tell writers not to think about the marketing of their book, actually. Think about how this chapter is structured, how this paragraph is structured, how this sentence is structured. That's what you got to be thinking about all the time. This very sentence. Don't worry about the marketing yet. Finish that sentence.
That's a really good point. I think that's one of the things that the trends of the questions that I had coming out is really how to stand out in a slush pile, for example, because the people understand the idea of this. You can imagine this slush pile, and you try to where does yours fit into it? Can you talk about what you're looking for and how somebody might think about how you've already touched on it a little bit, but maybe just talk about what you're looking for.
Sure, you want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah, so I can tell you the best advice about how to stand out in the slush pile, and that is, first of all, never submit to the slush pile. I'm with a very small publishing house, Dunderd, and we've suffered a lot during the pandemic. We shut down our operations for several months, and I was laid off. All the acquiring editors were laid off. Many small publishers have dealt with a similar problem. Although our submissions folder, the slush pile, is technically open, it's not getting looked at nearly as much as it should be, and months piled up, and we're taking our time getting through it. If you are serious about submitting to a publishing house, you will read something about that publishing house, and there are a couple of sources you can find that will tell you what they're looking for. The Writers Union of Canada produces a very useful newsletter that is constantly updated, that lists us all and lists specific editors and says, this is what so-and-so is looking for. If you go to my particular house's website, it'll have all the acquiring editors and our areas of interest. It'll say Russell Smith is interested in adult literary fiction and journalistic nonfiction and essays. Okay, so you know that then this is not just a person to send science fiction to, and you will find somebody else. If you've done that research, then you will be addressing your submission to a particular person, a name of a person. So you're already at a huge disadvantage if you're just sending into that general submissions pile. And this is not a difficult thing to do. So if that's the first thing I would tell everybody is make sure you've got a name. And frankly, before you come to me, I would go to Chelene. Because
come to me.
What?
I said, come to me. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I'm
taking notes here too, by the way. Check your emails later. Yeah.
I would very much recommend trying to find an agent first. But let's talk about that process later, because I'm not answering your question, which is about what I look for in the slush pile. So the basic answer is we don't look very much at the slush pile. When I go through it very, very quickly. And all I'm looking for is that very narrow subset of things that are in those little categories that I have carved out for myself. So it's adult literary fiction and journalistic nonfiction. So it means that 90% of it isn't going to fit that, because it's children's, it's YA, it's and if I do glance at a YA and if it looks interesting, I'll flip it over to another editor who does that. But it's far more effective if you can send it directly to that editor yourself. I will closely read anything that comes in with my name on it, addressed to me, to my email address. All right. So I will then pick out of the slush pile anything that says, this is an adult novel, it is completed. I'm much more interested in completed novels than in proposals for novels. Nonfiction is a little different. If it's a nonfiction proposal, I will read it if it's unfinished, if it seems to be of a topic that has been researched. I'm not particularly interested in personal memoir, and we can talk about how to define that and what the exceptions to that are. But if I'm quickly going through a slush pile, I'm more likely to be saying this is a book for nonfiction. This is a book that is about subject X, if subject X is not me. And that is because I'm going to be more impressed by somebody who's doing research on a subject or arguing about a subject than telling a personal story. There are many personal stories that are interesting, but actually they're in the minority in the memoir submissions. And I can talk at length about how I define nonfiction and memoir and what we're looking for in those. But I'm just briefly saying right now the things that are going to stand out at me from the slush pile. When I pick it out, I will very, very quickly go over the cover letter. I'm not too terribly interested in your life story or your publishing history. I am going to look at the first page of the writing. And that's going to be 95% of the decision for me right there is, what does it read like? Does it read like something I'd want to keep reading? So
Very
any other
interesting.
extraneous information like endorsements from your friend who runs a blog or a marketing plan or anything, I'm actually going to skim through very quickly. I'm not even going to read. I'm only going to look at the text itself.
Thank you, because that's also a question that came in, is the cover letter. So
I mean, a couple of things do stand out in cover letters. I am going to take a closer look at your submission if you have published somewhere before, but it just means that somebody else has taken a risk on you. So it's probably more worth a look for me, but I am going to read every submission that comes in to read directly, whether you're published or unpublished. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Chelene, do you want to add to that? And then I'm going to
Yes.
Brent to
Yes,
ask about his story.
yeah, I'll definitely add to that. And I think for me, the query letter that comes in for me as an agent is very important to me because I'm going to glean a lot of information and my next steps from that query letter. So for me, I definitely want to know what genre you're writing in. Is this book for me? That is step one. I don't want to spend a lot of time reading something only to find out, okay, I don't think this is the right project for me. So if I see that it's not, I'll flag it. And what I'll usually do is I'll go back and read it if I have time, and I'll see if there's another agent that I can then forward that submission to. So my colleagues and I at the Transatlantic work very closely together. So if there's something that I see, you know, this is really great, this has so much potential, but this is not in my wheelhouse, like I don't know how I would personally sell this, I'll definitely pass that submission on to another agent. So the query letter for me is really important. I agree with Russell. Make sure you're addressing this letter to me, do some research, look for, you know, my submission guidelines, what I'm looking for, and cater that letter to me. I want to know that you know who I am. You know, simultaneous submissions are fine for me, but again, be transparent about that information and have that in your query letter. Who else did you send this submission to? Is it someone at my agency? Should I know that you submitted to this person? So all these things are really important. And again, once I get to the first couple of pages of that excerpt, I'm then just focusing on the writing. I want to know, how is this paced? Is this language standing out to me? Is this person doing something unique with structure? All those questions are always spinning around in my head as an agent. And for me, I want to know who you are as an author. Do you want a career in this? Is this a one-off project for you? How can I help you as an agent? Like, how can I create and build this relationship with you? So lots of things can be gleaned from those initial moments with a submission. And for me, I do like it when authors know who their audience is, you know, so not to go too deep into a marketing plan, but if you can help me sell this book to an editor or publishing house, that process is only going to be, you know, that much tighter. Like I've got to then write a pitch letter based on your submission. I have to sell this to an editor who might have to then sell it to a really big team, right? So the tighter we can make that proposal or that pitch, the better your chances are. So that's kind of my first, you know, hour or so sitting with a submission. That's what I look for.
And Chelene, you make a good point that I brushed over too fast. The query letter is important for that, just that reason, that it's going to tell me what genre this is. Is this fiction, nonfiction, memoir? Is it adult, YA, whatever? and how many words I want to know as well. I
Yes.
want to know, is this a completed manuscript or is it a plan for a manuscript? Just so I can situate what it is that I'm looking at.
Definitely.
Yeah, I just want to quickly talk about it from the perspective of the New Quarterly, and I like that the query letter, because we get a lot of emerging writers, and part of it I really want to know, not the history, because like I said, it's the writing that's going to make the decision, but it's kind of more how committed they are to the craft of writing and where they are in you know, their writing career. So I just want to know a little bit of information. We don't need to know a lot of with what they're doing, but it just kind of gives me a sense of who they are in with their writing and what their plans are. So I'm going to just bring Brent in here, because I'm looking at his biography. He's had a lot of things going on these days. He's had a few books out and one coming. Do you want to talk a little bit about your path to publication and just share some of any tips that you've had going along the way?
Well, it's always interesting to hear editors and agents sort of talk about the things that I try to do when I'm approaching them with a project. And it's, you know, in general, I would say that the path to publication is epic. It's a really big learning curve. I mean, I assume when we're talking about that we have gotten to the point where we have a project that we're happy with, that we want to show other people. So, you know, that first bit of advice saying, make sure your project is as good as it can be. But once you're done writing it, and you're on that quest to try and get it put in a magazine or a journal or get it published as a book, it's quite an experience. And I've used, in the last couple of days, it occurs to me, I've used this analogy a couple of times, probably too many, but it's a lot like drinking from the fire hose. There's just so much information out there to try and distill into usable pieces, and it's easy to become discouraged. I know I have been on numerous occasions. So yeah, I mean, you just sort of go through all of the emotions. You go through laughter and crying and everything in between. And but you know, something that's really, really helped me throughout all of my projects and all of my rejections and successes is that idea of breaking things into small pieces. So once you've written your book, okay, is it as, you know, you sort of make a checklist. Is it as polished and well-written as I can make it? Good. Okay. Have I showed it to somebody else to make sure that it's as polished and well-written as it should be? Good. And so on and so forth, you know, to the query letter, to the, you know, making sure you have a synopsis ready, or all of these things. It's good to just bite it into manageable chunks, I think. But the overall experience is yeah, it's hard to, I mean, we could probably do a whole festival on it, to be honest, you know, just, you know, we got an hour here. So I'll just say that I think that it's good to break it down. Well,
that's useful. So, because it can be an overwhelming process. I'm just going to step back a bit.
Can I jump in? I want to tell you my story about getting my first book published, because a long time ago, but I think it might be instructive. And that is, it was in the early 90s. I finished the book. I sent it to all the major publishers, the big presses of the country, who immediately sent me back a form letter saying they did not look at unsolicited manuscript. They recommended that I go to an agent so that I get represented by an agent first. They didn't look at manuscripts that weren't represented by agents. I then went to all the agents in the country. There were about, I don't know, there were probably 8 big ones at the time. They all immediately sent me back a form letter saying they did not represent unpublished writers. And so that's when I went to the small presses, and I went, the small presses would read unsolicited submissions, and one of them picked me up immediately. But when I counted up all of my rejections, including agents and publishing houses, I had 17 rejections. And that book went on to be nominated for the Governor General's Award, and the University of Toronto Rare Books Library just asked me for my archives, and I gave them proudly that file with those 17 rejections, which are now there for researchers to look at. So I would just say, hang on to those rejections. That is your biographers.
And keep the faith, I guess, eh? You know,
yes,
as you're going through all of this.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the reality of the world that we live in. And I talk to a lot of classes, and I think, anybody who would, no one would be choose to do this profession if you just kind of landed it into, you know, if you were an accountant, because, you know, can you imagine where 98% of your day job was rejection? You know, this is actually, when you put the numbers to it, it's a very poor percentage. So you need to have that tenacity for sure, and you kind of being creative and trying to get your work out there. I'm just going to take a little step back and have a look at literary journals, because that's obviously a subject that's very close to my heart. But each of you have had some experience with literary journals. We've either published you, or you, Chelene, you also were work with Room. I just kind of talk about the importance of literary journals. Brent, do you want to talk about that? We've published you. I'm not putting you on the spot, but you know, we have published you with fiction and nonfiction.
Right.
What's your thoughts?
You always read, when, again, going back to that moment where you decide you'd like to publish or get something published, you read about things like establishing a track record, building a reputation. Personally, I found a lot of that very, very intimidating, because, you know, it's like that, you know, make sure you come back when you have some experience when you're in a job interview, but how do you get job experience unless you actually get jobs, right? But again, that idea of breaking it down, submitting, and yeah, I think it's super important. Literary journals are, if not for that track record and reputation, then certainly for the writer's confidence. So getting that work out there and knowing that someone somewhere has, as Russell said, taken a risk on your writing and in print. It's, you know, that it's an incredible accomplishment to be able to say that. And the confidence boosting is really great. And that can take you into those next steps a lot more easily if you have a couple of publishing credits, not only just on that query letter, but it's just nice to know I'm a published writer moving on, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from our perspective, you know, we are, you know, we're able to take chances where, you know, if you publish somebody with a short story or poem or essay in a way that allows them to kind of test the waters and for one thing, and also often it's the first time people are working with an editor. And so there was that experience of you know, that kind of conversation between editor and writer that literary journals provide. I think it's also really important because it does kind of put you into a kind of literary community, because once you are published in literary journals, the literary journals tend to be a very supportive environment. You know, for us at New Quarterly, when we publish people, we want them to stay in touch. We want them to keep submitting to us. We want to know when their book is being published so that we can promote them. We want to invite them to our festival. So it's a really kind of a supportive environment that, because I know we recognize it's difficult. So I think it's one of those things that people may not necessarily recognize. You get the publishing credit for sure, you know, published in Room, published in New Quarterly. That's, you know, hopefully that is some recognition for when you go to Shalene or Russell with your book. But it like as Brent said, I think there's a real confidence issue as well as some really sort of practical benefits to submitting and to being published in literary journals.
Well, and it puts a real human face on. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it also puts a real human face on all of those emails you send out, submissions at, or whatever it is. It you know, and if you're fortunate enough to know editors or agents personally, that is such an incredible advantage. But if you don't, like me, I got back from teaching overseas and I knew no one. Being able to finally be connected with an editor at the New Quarterly or wherever else was just such a, wow, there's people there at the other end of that email address, you know?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think literary magazine publications are incredibly important. And you know, when I was at Room Magazine, I had a different approach to the whole cover letter. I didn't look at them at all. I just went right to the writing. And then if I liked the piece, then I would go back and say, okay, who is this person? You know, how can I help them, right? So it's, you know, you're in a different pond. But I think with the literary magazines, that whole idea of community and helping a writer start their career, that's what a lot of literary magazines do. So I think it's really important to focus on, you know, emerging writers who might not have publishing credits. I know I had 0 publishing credits when I published with the first magazine, but that whole idea of helping a writer get to that next level. Like a lot of the writers who won contests at Room Magazine, that was their very first publication. And, you know, some agents and scouts even are looking at these magazines to find writers, right? I know I'm always investigating, and I'm actually looking for writers who maybe haven't written a book, or maybe someone who I think should be writing a book. So I have a whole list of book ideas, books I want to see in the world. And I'm trying to sometimes match a writer or an author to these books. So you just never know where a literary magazine publication can take you.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think it's also for literary magazines are not just for emerging writers. And we publish established writers all the time, you know, with trying new things. You know, we had a piece by Helen Humphreys not too long ago. We got one from Kathleen Winter coming up. So it is a kind of, it can be a kind of testing ground for people doing new and innovative things. So, and we're not driven by the kind of market forces that, you know, sort of certainly big publishers are driven by. So we're not about trends.
Yeah.
Open. Okay. We have a question about when a manuscript, when should you submit a manuscript, particularly nonfiction? So I know that we did talk about, I think Russell, you said, you know, for fiction, it needs to be complete. We don't want to have any kind of, you know, sort of proposal, but with nonfiction, when should they actually approach either an agent or an editor?
Yeah, I would say that if you have what you think is a very strong idea for a nonfiction book and you've written some of it, I mean, I will need to see some of it. I will need to see, say, 3 sample chapters to see that you can actually write. But I think it's worth pitching the idea before you finish it. That would involve a proposal that would have several parts. The main parts are a summary, a description of who you are, a summary of what the book is about and what the main argument is, a table of contents, set of comparisons to other books on the subject where your book stands out or fits in and fills a gap on that subject, and then your sample chapters. The reason that I'd be happy to see a proposal before the book is finished is that I might come back to you and say, you know what? No, this isn't exactly the angle I think you should take that we would publish. I would suggest that you actually don't focus on this aspect of it, but I'd be more interested in a proposal on this aspect of it. And it might save you writing a book that a lot of editors are going to say is not right for us right now. So I think if a nonfiction book, and again, I'm talking about books that involve research on a subject or argument about a subject. I'm including essays in that, not your life story. But if to make your life story interesting, it's going to be the writing that I'm focused on. Right? Whereas with other nonfiction books, I am interested in research, journalism, argument, history, that kind of thing. So with nonfiction, yes, I'd be happy to see a detailed proposal. And in fact, quite recently, somebody sent me a detailed proposal with that was some focus on contemporary masculinity. And I focused on one aspect of it. And I said, the whole book doesn't sound terribly original to me, but this one aspect, and it did involve an aspect of his life story, I said, that would be a book that we would publish. Go back and write me another proposal. And he did it. And I think we're going to take it. So that's why the proposals
Very
can be
cool.
Interesting. Thank you. Shalene, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, definitely. I think, you know, I'll put the agent hat on. I have so many different hats, but for me, I'm okay with working with authors who their manuscript might not be where it needs to be for me to then pitch it to editors. And obviously I can't do that a lot because that is a lot of work. And most agents, you know, we work on commission. So I'm working hours and hours and hours and hours. And, you know, that's just out of love for this industry, right? So, I mean, I do take clients on who need that editorial help because I have a background in editing. I want to help these authors get their books where they need to be. So for me, I'm okay with some manuscripts who do need, you know, a little bit of coaxing, a little bit of massaging, but I think it's really important for the author to know, you know, where they see their book living. What do they want this book to do? What do they want people to do when they're holding it, right? And that will kind of help you figure out, do you want to go directly to a small press? Do you want to go to an agent? And agents do work with small presses as well. I think there's kind of that assumption that agents are only selling and only pitching to the big trade publishers, which is not necessarily the case. Like, we have great relationships with small presses, and some of our authors want to stay with small presses, which also makes sense too, right? So it's just knowing what you want for your book. But in terms of knowing when to actually submit it, the nonfiction that I take is mostly memoir. So I would want a complete memoir. I don't really take on a lot of, researchy nonfiction type books yet. I'm focused more on literary fiction and memoir, and some commercial fiction as well. So just get the writing as polished as you can. And again, have those comparable titles. That is so important for me as an agent, to know where the book stands and how I can sort of, again, create that pitch for the book. So the more information I have, it just makes things a lot easier.
I could add something to this idea of what Shalene just said, the comparable titles. We call them comp titles. Those come up in the pub board meetings when one editor is pitching to the rest of the company that they want that company to invest money in. And someone at every meeting is going to say, okay, what are your comp titles? In other words, give me probably, if it's a Canadian writer, a Canadian title on a similar subject with a similar vibe to it, so we can see how that did. Are there any books that sold well? And we can actually look up the numbers. And this is a very high stress moment in pitching, because you've really got to try to show some track record for what you're talking about. And if there is no track record, you have to argue, believe me, this is going to be the one thing that we haven't seen before that's going to sell very well. And there's, a financial officer in the room who is not a literary person and has to be convinced that this thing is going to sell. So that's why the comp titles are important. And it's probably not so useful to say, the best comparison to this is 50 Shades of Grey, right? This is going to sell just as much as 50 Shades of Grey, because that's unrealistic. Pick up smaller local one that did well, where we can see that you might be right about that. Right? But to say this book is going to sell 100 million copies is not very useful to me. One other thing about the idea of pitching the proposal as opposed to the finished book that's worth bearing in mind is, a lot of people think, well, I'll go to a publisher and they're going to give me an advance on royalties, which is going to enable me to write this book. And certainly if you're a very famous journalist going to a very big publishing house, that's true. But that's not true for 99% of us. And it's certainly not true for my small publishing house. I cannot give you an advance of $70,000 so that you can spend the rest of the year researching and writing this thing. Basically, you're going to be funding it yourself. So while I can sign a contract and say, yes, we'll publish this book when it comes out, it doesn't really help you that much to have the contract signed, 2 years in advance, because you still got to fund it and you still got to write it.
So I think there's authors have to learn how to be creative with their pitching and their marketing. It sounds like, Shalene, you help with that a bit, and in the process of putting together a proposal, but you're really looking for authors to be as active as possible in putting that package together.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for all the reasons that Russell just stated, but I think that's part of the trouble that authors face, is there is not a lot of transparency around these types of things. So when an agent or an editor is asking for comp titles, I'll often see responses in the query letters where authors say, there is no such book like this. There is nothing like this. I'm like, that very well may be the case, but it's so unhelpful for me. So not having the author not really understand the weight of these things, right? So having more conversations around it is so helpful, to build in that transparency around the publishing process. And I will say, everyone should read this book, if you're What Editors Do, edited by Peter, I think it's Peter Ginna. It's a really excellent, eye-opening glimpse into the publishing world, and it really talks about all the extra stuff that editors do, that when I was just entering into the publishing industry, I had no idea. I thought, well, editors, they just sit down with manuscripts, right? That's it. But there's so much business around it, like the amount of work that editors take on, and the business side, and the number crunching, and all of that. I think it's just so valuable for authors to kind of educate themselves in terms of what actually goes on in this industry. And I think that will help you enter into it in a more, intentional way. So I just had to to say you have to read this book, what editors do. I find it absolutely fascinating. So,
Well, thank you. I
I'm a
think
nerd,
there's
so
the transparency part is really important. I think that's why these
huge.
conversations are really useful. Sorry, did somebody else jump in there? I have something to say. Okay, all right. So one of the questions we had is if somebody is lucky enough to get published, and this is something that I think that Brent has experienced, someone is lucky enough to get published by an independent press, do they, does that mean that the subsequent books will be published by the same publisher? And what does that process look like? You know, if you do you go to the same small press? Do you shop around? Could have got a better, you know, offer, or what does that process look like? Do you want to talk about your
Sure,
experience?
yeah. I have not. I've got 2 books out with Dundurn. I've got Boy that just came out, and I've got Nothing But Life coming out in February. And then my first novel was published with Invisible Publishing, and then my short fiction collection will be out with Guernica. So I've the answer to that question is we really would love it if it was as easy as that. Once you give a book to a publisher, they're your publisher for life. I mean, wouldn't that be reassuring to know? But my experience has not been that. Every book has had to convince the publisher that they want to publish it again. So Invisible passed on Boy, for example, but Rachel Spence at Dundurn, loved it. And so she picked up that book, and then she picked up Nothing But Life as well. That happened to work out really, really well. But I knew for my short fiction collection that I wouldn't be able to publish with Dundurn because they don't focus on short fiction. And so I was actually using the slush pile quite aggressively. And so that happened there. I think in general, you know, we hear about the stories of writers who do stay with the same publisher the whole way through, and that would be great. But I think for the vast majority of us, I think we do need to just simply make sure that whatever we write it so that the person receiving it will fall in love with it, whether it's our current editor at the publisher we're at now, or whether we have to move on like I had to do with Boy, that someone else will fall in love with it. And again, that goes back to just making sure that I'm producing the best work that I possibly can, especially now. There's so much competition out there. There are so many fewer guarantees than 30 years ago in terms of what authors can expect from their publishers. Yeah, so I'm fairly, well, I guess, how would I say this? I'm familiar with the idea that it's not always the case that they're going to just snap up the next book automatically.
I can speak to that from 2 points of view, one from the writers, but also from a technical contract point of view. So let me just address what your contract obligations usually say. So usually if you sign with one publisher, there's going to be a clause in that they're buying one book, usually.
Yeah, that's true.
Sometimes
That's
they'll
right.
buy 2 or 3 books at once, but if they're buying one book from you, there's a clause in it that's called the right of first refusal. And that means that they have the right to look at your next book length manuscript in that genre. So if you submitted a novel, it will say next book length work of fiction. You have to submit it to us first, and then we will make a decision as to whether we want it or not before you can submit it to someone else. That doesn't mean that you have to publish with that same publisher.
That's right.
It means you give it to them first. They have the right to think about it, and if they want it, they can make you an offer. You don't have to take that offer. You can say, thank you, I'm moving on to someone else, but you have to give them that chance first. That's the standard clause in the contract. So it just gives that, it's a politeness to your publisher to show it to them first, but it doesn't really bind you to anything. That said, publishers are a lot less loyal to their authors than they claim to be, and a lot, as Brent says, a lot less than they used to be because the current economic situation is so fragile. So I published my first 2 books with a small press. I then moved to a big press. I was with Doubleday for a couple of books, and then I had a disagreement with some editing over a novel, and so I went to HarperCollins. HarperCollins was, this is the mid 2000s. HarperCollins was very pleased to have me. They thought they'd stolen me from Doubleday. I remember going to my first meeting with my editor there in his big office downtown Toronto, and there was a little surprise party for me. My name was on a screen in the reception area. They had champagne. The CEO came out and he made a speech about how we don't just publish books, we publish authors. And the idea of the speech was that, we're going to be with you through your whole career. This is just the beginning. The next book I wrote was a book of short stories. I took it to my editor at HarperCollins and I said, here you go, here's my next book. And she said, oh, Russell, we don't do short stories. And that was that. That was it. That was the end of my relationship with HarperCollins. So forget about this champagne and promises that we are going to just publish authors. It would be nice, as Brent said, to think that we're just going to have one published the rest of the time, but publishers are fickle and they will drop you like a hot brick if you don't sell them, or if you come up with some crazy idea like writing short stories. and so then I ended up with Biblioasis for my next book, and I'm actually much happier there because I'm a sort of a bigger fish in a smaller pond and I get more attention there. But we can talk about the advantages of small presses later. But I hope that answers the question about your obligations to one publisher.
Yeah, that helped.
Yeah.
That clause in the contract is I totally forgot about my contracts, pandemics and book launches and everything. Yeah, no, I totally had forgotten about that. And that's the reason, of course, that Invisible saw Boy. I had given it to them before, and then Dundurn picked it up. And then Rachel Spence at Dundurn saw the short story collection, loved it, but she said, look, commercially, Dundurn is not a not-for-profit. We have to make sure that we can sell these things, and we pick up almost no short story collections. So, but I did have to show them that book. So,
Brent, I love your short stories. What does John Metcalf not want to publish you? My God.
See, this is we should talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, offline.
We'll connect in the green room afterwards.
As someone who's published Brent, I can recommend him. We're actually at the point of our time that we're going to open up questions. I think our time of chatting went by really quickly. I think one of the things that does, just to kind of finish up what you were saying, is there's a lot of what you're talking about is about doing your research, knowing the publishers, the potential there, and there's a kind of tenacity, and you've got to be really working hard, and you've actually got to be facing the fact that rejection is really a big part of that, and I think it's a really hard thing to think about for writers, is how to deal with that rejection. And I think that what you have illustrated in your own individual stories is that you really just have to kind of get up and keep trying again and keep trying again, and if you believe in your work and you've done the work that we have a strong piece of work, then that tenacity and keep going is really part of that.
I would add just one more thing on the general subject, which is and about whether to submit to slush pile or unsolicited. Most of the books that we're publishing, not all, but most, are represented by agents. And so if an agent comes to me with a book, I'm really going to take it more seriously because that agent's already done the work of vetting it, and I respect the agents because they're doing all the filtering work for me. If they like it, I'm going to take it very seriously. If I get an email from Chelene saying, here's a manuscript I might like, I'm going to sit to attention and I'm going to say, I'm going to have this read in the next couple of days, right? That's your advantage if you have an agent. It means somebody has already invested in you. And so I'm going to take it very seriously. So that's, and you develop relationships with agents where if you work together, you start to figure out what you're into, what I'm into. You start to realize what go-to editors are going to be the ones for your kind of stuff, and so it just makes everything smoother for you. It's not easy to get an agent. It's just hard.
It's hard. I think that's important for folks to know, though. That I think the agent role is very much focused on relationship building. Like I'll spend a good part of my week just calling up editors and saying, like, can we just talk? Like, let's chat about, what's on your list? Like, what are you looking for? And that's how I have a better sense of where to send an author's book, because I have these relationships with editors and I'm trying to get to know so many editors and what they're interested in. So yeah, that's a really good point to make.
So I'm just going to move to some of the questions here.
Yes.
There's a question about whether age of the writer influences the submission process.
I think so. I used to give, and it's two of the best pieces of writing advice I ever received were when I was quite young, and I'm thankful to have received them. So I'm going to, when I was teaching at Redeemer University here in Hamilton, I would give this piece of advice to typically younger writers. I would say two things. One, become best friends with rejection. Just learn not to take every rejection personally. It can be a way to make you a better writer. this is something you have to go through nowadays. Well, not everybody, but we don't like those people very much. The second piece of advice is just to have another piece of work on the go, right? And for young writers who have written a book or something or a story, it's so tempting to sort of say, I've got this magical piece, and I've been through this myself, is saying, I'm just going to put it into the world and I'm going to wait. And you can do that. But the waiting is excruciating, because as Russell and Chelene have both alluded to, the timelines are completely unpredictable. You never know when something's going to be picked up. Somebody could be a day, it can be 3 years. And so I think it can have something to do with it. When you're younger, you can kind of get this, you have this attitude that, well, I'm going to write something and I'm going to put it out there, and that's what I'm going to do. And I found that more with my younger students. So I hope that answers the question.
I can say that as far as when I'm looking at submissions, no, I'm completely not influenced. I hope I'm not at all influenced by somebody's age. That's not going to be a factor at all, whether you're young, just starting out, or if it's your 10th book, or if it's your first book and you're 80. I'm only going to be interested in the book. I mean, I suppose I'd have to admit the very extreme ends would interest me because it's a novelty. If you said, I am 94 and this is my first book, I'm going to take an unusual interest in that. But similarly, if you say I'm 16 and this is my first book, I'm going to take an unusual interest in that. But anything in between that, no, I don't care.
So that, I guess, leading on to that, another question is basically, when is someone who is looking to publish for the first time with no significant past publication history, what's the best way of searching for a publisher?
I really like this publication that the Writers Union of Canada sends out, a pamphlet. You can write to them, and it's like $7 or $8 or something. They'll mail it to you, and it's regularly updated. It's a list of all the publishers and all the agents in Canada, and with very briefly what they're looking for. Once you get a list of the publishing houses, you would go to their websites and you go to their submissions guidelines. They'll say what we're looking for, and often there'll be a list of acquiring editors where you can look at their bios and you'll see what they're looking for. Same with agencies. I mean, Chelene can speak to this, but if you go to your website, you could, you'll be a bio of each one of the agents and what they kind of specialize in, and so you will write to them specifically.
Okay. What flaws do you forgive in a submission if you can see the potential in the story?
That's a good question.
That's from Monica.
Chelene,
I think for me, if I can see the potential in the story, I will forgive all flaws. In the query letter, like, let's say you spelt my name wrong. I don't care. Everything autocorrects to Charlene. It's not a big deal. But I mean, the writing essentially is what we're after. And because for me personally, I read so many manuscripts at different phases. Like, I read that really early rough draft terribleness, like I look at my rough drafts, and then I'm working with students and I'm working with new writers through my writing studio. So I see the roughness, and then I work, as a freelance editor, I see the kind of midway manuscripts and I see where, the work needs to go. And then as an agent, I'm expecting this top tier polished manuscript. But I think, if the writing is doing something really unique and the structure is just throwing me for a loop, I'm really fascinated by structure and the way that stories move on the page. Like, what is the container you've built for this story? If you can create something that is unexpected and that I've never seen before, I will definitely forgive some of these flaws, right? And we're all human and we make mistakes, and I'm not too worried about it. And if I have the information I need to make a decision, that's great. But often I'll just go back to the writer and say, hey, I need these 3 things from you. Like, I'm reading your manuscript, it's really great, but can you help me? Like, I need these 3 things, right? So I'm a big communicator. I usually email folks if I'm interested in a manuscript. I will email this writer and I will say, listen, I have 4 manuscripts ahead of yours. It's gonna take me like 4 weeks before I can even get to this, but I want you to know that I've seen it and I am going to read it, and I'm requesting, the full manuscript. So I kind of communicate in that way, where folks know where their manuscript is sitting. when it comes to me. And there's hundreds of queries in there every day. They just keep like, right? So I try to be as, transparent as I can around that. Yeah.
I
We
agree.
have just a few minutes left.
Okay.
Sorry, did you want to add to that, Russell? Go ahead.
No, I would echo the same thing. I forgive a lot. If a manuscript comes in and a chapter doesn't make sense and there's a whole part of the story is left dangling, that's okay. That can all be fixed.
Yes.
That it's the overall arc of it, whether the ending is planned out, that kind of thing is much more important than little things that can be fixed.
Okay. Thank you. We've actually had a few questions about self-publishing versus traditional publishing, and I guess the question is, is that a valid route? Can you go from self-publishing into traditional, or what's your thoughts on the self-publishing option?
I would very much strongly recommend against self-publishing, and for a couple of reasons. One is, first of all, if you self-publish a book and then come to me or any other publisher and say, now I'd like this to have some kind of commercial entity, we're not going to take it. We're not going to publish anything that has been previously published, whether you self-publish it or not. It has to be unique to us, and we have to be the first people to publish it. So that's one thing. The second thing is that unless you're part of our genre community, and this is an important caveat, that certain genre books do extremely well self-published online, and 50 Shades of Grey was one of those. It was Twilight fan fiction. It had an immense following on Twilight fan fiction erotica sites, and that's what enabled it to take off when it was actually published. And romance, certain other kinds of fan fiction also have certain subgenres of romance have large online followings. If you are part of that and part of that community, and you can publish to that community and you know how to communicate with them, then self-publishing is possible. I don't really deal with that kind of genre fiction. In terms of literary fiction, self-publishing can only damage the future of that book. You don't have any kind of big marketing apparatus behind you. It's like putting up a poster in your basement. No one is going to see it. And no matter how many social media friends you have, say you have 800 Facebook friends, you think, great, well, there's 800 sales right there. I mean, even if every single one of them buys it, which is unlikely, 800 is not enough, right? So you're really deluding yourself into thinking that this can be successful. I would, unless you're part of an online genre community, don't do it.
Yeah, I can sort of echo that a little bit, because when we got back from overseas, I had done some work for magazines in Kuwait, and when we were living in the Middle East, and I had a monthly slot where I would publish, 750 words to 1,000, sort of a creative take on something happening locally. And so when I got back to Canada, I actually self-published those stories and poems and essays in a book, and very quickly learned that as a literary writer, while there's nothing, in theory wrong with putting your work out there as a self-published writer, it's not received well in the circles where I ended up. Not that the stories were bad, they weren't, not that the writing, not that it didn't look good. I like design, I designed it, it looks professional. There's just sort of a cachet, and it's a bit unfortunate in that people sort of judge ahead of time, but there is a cachet that if you're traditionally published, that opens more doors in terms of just people being comfortable with talking to you about your writing more. It feels a little weird to say that, because I don't want to discourage anybody from writing anything. And I think, if self-publishing is what the goal is, either genre or otherwise, more power to you. But if your goal is to publish and be well received, that can be a real hurdle. And that's what I found. I would say, I self-published a couple of story collections. One story collection after that essay collection from the Middle East, just old stories I had no other place for. Oh, okay, that's nice. And crickets, and I certainly couldn't use it as a publishing credit. I found that out very, very quickly. That was not something that was accepted.
It's also not eligible for literary awards. And true. That's the primary thing that's going to create bestsellers in this country, is literary awards.
Mm-hmm.
Chelene, do you have any comments on self-publishing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add just a couple of logistical things as an author myself. The one thing that I think I would miss out on if I were to have self-published would be the editorial guidance, which I think is so important.
true too.
And so, you know, so many books out there that are self-published, you know, and I've read a few of them and I'm like, oh, but what if they did this, you know? So it really comes down to what your resources are and what you could feasibly pull together to make this book the best it can be and get into all the hands that it needs to be in, right? So marketing is one thing, but also that editorial guidance. And I'm working on a novel now and working with my editor, and I'm like, thank the Lord for this person, right? Because as an author, you're writing something and you're so inside your story, you're so inside of it. And even though I'm an editor myself, some of these things that are being pointed out, I would never come to these conclusions without this editor's guidance. So unless you're self-publishing and you have that editorial guidance, great. But I think all these resources that you get when you publish in the traditional route is just, they're unmatched. You can't replace that.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm just going to take a moment to just kind of wrap up with something that when I'm out talking to students, I talk about this, and it's the idea of being a literary citizen, which I think is really important to me, and I think it's something that writers don't think about. And what I mean by that is that we all of us here on the screen put a lot of work and effort into our own work, and also working with as editors and agents. And I think there's something about writers being really engaged in a literary community that is really important. And I don't know that writers think about that. I think that they think about writing something and then just sending it to somebody, and without realizing that actually to be a literary citizen means that you should go to festivals, you should listen to other writers talk, you should listen to other writers give advice, you should go to readings and then go up to afterwards to the writer and say, I love this reading, it's been inspiring, and buy their book and get them to sign it. Volunteer at literary festivals, volunteer at literary journals. I think the idea of the writer being working in isolation and not part of a community is something that we all have to kind of get past and talk about as an industry. So it's not just about having a number of Facebook followings, but it is actually being responsible for keeping the kind of ecosystem alive. And I think that by being connected in that way, you meet other writers, you meet editors, you meet agents when you're out in the world, and that will help you to become, I think, a more engaged writer. So that's
huge. That's huge. I think community is massive and we don't talk about it enough. When I think about my route, starting as an unknown author to being an agent, none of that would have happened without community, without me going to workshop groups, without me attending readings and being the quiet introvert in the back corner, and having someone say, hey, you should be at the table here with us, right? Sometimes it just takes that small act of bringing folks to the table, and all these wonderful opportunities just pour out of that. So community is massive, massive. I will echo that. Yes.
Yeah, I think we will end on a positive note where everybody can be part of the community. So it makes the rejection is part of what this community, what this industry is about, unfortunately. But having community and being a part of it so that you can exchange information and just being connected, I think, is really important. Wow, this hour has flown by, I think. Yes, I am so grateful for having you all here. This has been fantastic. Really interesting to go do a deep dive into the process and, from the various angles. So thank you, Russell. Thank you, Shalene. Thank you, Brent.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
This was great.
Thank you, guys.
So I guess I just want to say that the Shalene, Russell, and Brent's books are all available at our local, which is Wordsworth Books. And I'll do my kind of extension of my literary citizen, and I'm hearing a lot about independent bookstores and how they need our support as well, especially in these times. And I would encourage you to go out to Wordsworth and buy the books of our panel members, or go to your local independent, because I think we really need to, buying a book makes a huge difference for people. So I would encourage you to do that. The link to to Wordsworth is actually in our chat box, so you can check that out. Also, just a reminder to people that this event has been brought to you free of charge as part of our Wild Writers. And if you feel compelled to donate to the festival to support it, we would be welcome that. And there's also a link for that in our chat box. We have the festival is continuing tomorrow, and we're going to have Emily Urquhart talking about the age of aging and creativity. And that's with Emily Urquhart, Susan Swan, and Jane Byers.
Oh, wow.
And that is it for us today. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us. We've had over 100 people here on this beautiful sunny afternoon, and I'm sure that there will be many, many more looking at the recording afterwards. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. We could have made this a 2-hour session for sure.
Easily.
We're trying
Yes.
to limit our Zoom time for everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you.